Good morning, everyone. First, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here and to present at the LSE Research Showcase series. Today, what we will present is an impact project that we did at the Department of Economic History. And it's essentially, as you can see from the title, is about teaching colonialism in the classroom. Teaching colonialism in UK schools is often framed through ideological debates. So essentially, it's like less evidence-based than being more ideology-driven. In this project, what our goal was is essentially, or our goal is still, is to introduce a new economic history approach to teaching colonialism in UK schools. So this project we carried out with, in collaboration with the Historical Association in the UK. And essentially the objective was to introduce teachers to an evidence-based economic history perspective. Why is this important? We think because at the end of the day, as economic historians, economic history is really about linking archival sources, making use of novel archival sources, making use of quantitative data, as well as qualitative sources of information, and doing comparative analysis across regions. So the objective is essentially by introducing this new evidence-based perspectives that we can provide teachers with more structured tools to guide pupils in studying economic history, studying the structure of incentives, institutions, and long-run outcomes. So that we can essentially approach the same problems, the same debates that are currently being taught from a purely like more ideological perspective through evidence-based approaches. To give you an idea about essentially the impact project, this was like a project that lasted for about a year. We started first, like it was a selection process by application from teachers at the GCSE and A levels who applied to the Historical Association in the UK. And then those who were accepted went through the following. There was first a 3-day residential course for the teachers that took place here at LSE. And in this residential course, we provided them with unique materials and trying essentially to frame the studying of colonialism through economic history questions. Then following this residential course, we did an extended program of online sessions. So they had like a month or 2 months on like basically online sessions and like based on online reading lists. The residential course focused on, which I will describe in more detail in the next slides, included sessions on questions of resistance to colonial authorities, questions of trade, capital, labor, land, resource, and resources more generally, and economic nationalism and independence movements. Then this was followed by, like each session would have like more lecture, like the first part would be a lecture by one of us. And then the second part would be like more interactive workshops in which teachers would be discussing how to formulate inquiries that they can then take to the classroom. In terms of like the structure of the course, we tried to have like good regional coverage. So my colleagues, Lee Gardner, focused on Sub-Saharan Africa, Tirthankar, who will be presenting today, also focused on the Southeast Asian experience, and myself focused on the Middle East and North Africa. So that's like, so essentially within each question, we would have like these 3 regions being represented. So I'm going to walk you through like what we did in more detail, and then I will describe a bit about my focus on the Middle East and North Africa to show you like 2 examples of how we thought about this new evidence-based approach would change our priors and change the way we think about things. So in session 1, we focused on, the title was Stories of Resistance to Colonial Economic Activity. So we discussed how economic activity under colonialism changed the incentive structures facing local actors and changed the constraints that then shaped the different forms of domestic resistance to these colonial authorities. In the second session, we focused on globalization and colonial trade, so essentially questions of integration of colonies into global markets, how this transformed the pre-colonial fiscal structure and the commercial system. In the third session, we discussed capital and business in the colonies, how company formation, how capital flows and governance, how they were shaped by colonialism, by certain concessions that were made, for example, in the case of Middle East and North Africa, like concessions to the imperial powers, and how this was shaped essentially under the imperial political economy, so to speak. In session 4 and 5, we switched to topics of labor and land. So in session 4, labor in the colonies, we discussed different labor regimes, slavery, corvée systems, indentured, and wage labor. And we discussed how they varied across regions and how colonial authorities employed or altered the existing labor structures or the existing labor institutions to find labor resources. In session 5, we discussed land tenure, agriculture, water rights, and resource extraction. Again, how colonialism shifted the narrative, shifted essentially the acquisition rights to these resources. In session 6, we discussed independence movements and economic nationalism from an economic history lens, studying how the economic incentives shaped the nationalist movements and how these movements were largely driven by economic grievances, inequalities, and colonial legacies. So I'm going to show you in the last 2 slides 2 examples. I thought because it's a very short presentation that visuals are maybe the best way to show at least what I did in my part. So this is, for example, showing you essentially the part of my discussion of labor in the colonies within the Middle East and North Africa. So this is on trade and migration. And specifically here, the goal was to have a new, fresh perspective instead of studying the problem always from the viewpoint of colonialism versus domestic populations. Here I tried to provide a more nuanced view, looking at trans-Saharan slave trade and how this was a very old trade that long predated colonialism, and how this pre-colonial trade that existed from, let's say, 7th century or even earlier, how it shifted under colonialism, through the abolitionist movement and so on. And then how it still has legacies today. So if you look at the trans-Saharan trade routes that crossed the Sahara, they pretty much persist today if you look at the migration routes that migrants follow today in the coming from sub-Saharan Africa. So there is this persistence essentially of routes of trade and labor coercion, so to speak. Now, why is this important? Because it provides this more nuanced view of how colonialism shaped labor coercion. So interestingly, in the 19th century in the Middle East, the colonial authorities were, even before direct colonialism in the late 19th century, so we're talking about within the early to mid 19th century, the focus was on the abolition of slavery. But in doing so, the focus of the abolitionist movement was less about the local coercive systems that existed, in particular the local state, the domestic state coercion of labor. And the reason was that this domestic forms of labor coercion were less known, were more fine-grained and more deeply rooted, I would say, in the colonial settings that, or in the domestic settings that the abolitionist movement did not know about them. They could understand slavery, but they did not know how state coercion of labor work of the peasantry. And this is important because actually in my research, I show how this domestic slavery played a big role, or how this domestic forms of local labor played a big role and was in many ways even bigger than the trans-Saharan slave trade. Another example comes from the nationalist movement. So this is on like session 6 topic about the 1879 National Manifesto. So this is a less known episode in history of democratization, so to speak, in the Middle East and North Africa, in which essentially what happened is that Egypt defaulted on its debt in 1876. And because of this, there was like this domestic democratic movement that emerged, and its goal essentially was to provide executive constraints, is to impose executive constraints. So they wanted to write a new constitution to limit the monarch's power and to make sure from now on that any debt, any new loan is actually approved by the parliament. So what we can see here, this is a national manifesto. It was essentially published in 1879. It says that, it's in Arabic, of course, but it says that they wanted that the parliament essentially be given full power as they have in European countries. And here we can see the people who signed it. So this was signed by domestic elites, essentially by a wide range of domestic elites. So these sources of like more local archives-based narratives are often missed when we just limit the focus on colonial archives and on colonial perspectives. So I should end here. I just say that essentially teachers afterwards translated these economic history concepts into inquiries. And then essentially the resources are now being piloted in schools and disseminated through the historical association. So I shift the talk to my colleague Tirthankar.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for being here. It's a great pleasure to address you. I will talk about how the history of colonialism, empire figures in my research, in which it's a big field, but not quite in a biographical way. I'll use my research as an example to illustrate how the field itself has changed. It's asking different questions in the last 15 odd years. And in that shift, economic history and economic historians like me have played a very significant role, a driving role. So I'm an example of a larger group who are leading this change. There are, I can class my research into three broad areas. One is India, South Asia, the region from which I came, the empire, especially the British Empire, and the environment. Now, there is a connection between these three fields, and I'll try to indicate how they are connected. In the field of imperial studies, especially the economic history, I show you two books that I co-authored with other people and which captures some of the more recent research that I talked about. If you were studying this maybe 20, 25 years before, I was a college student a long time ago, but when I was, I would again study empire, but in a very different way. If you had asked this question about how the British Empire shaped the economies of Asia and Africa, the answer would start from some explanation of what the imperialists wanted from Asia and Africa, whether that's resource extraction or geopolitical stability, or dominance, something along those lines. That has changed, and it has changed through a different way of doing research on the colonies, which Mohamed also talked about, mainly from the perspective of the colonies themselves, using their archives. And the change has been primarily in this direction. The imperialists may have wanted whatever they wanted, but they didn't always get it. In fact, very rarely they got it, because these were not normal states. I mean, if you take away military power, they were extremely constrained in a variety of ways. That leads to the question of what kind of states these were. I mean, they are not as states as we imagine them today. First of all, they had divided heads. Two heads in London and Delhi doing different things. They relied very heavily on local structures of power, whether these are princely states or landlords or warlords. There was the bureaucratic capacity was very small. Extensive army, yes. Fiscal capacity was also small. They collected too little taxes to do anything other than mind, defense, and policing. So when you have that kind of a state, the question opens up, then how do we read the effects? If we see the empire as a state structure, there are other ways of seeing the empire, maybe a market system, maybe a global system. But if you see them as a state, then the question opens up, then how do you read the effects of a state which is basically very weak in most cases, except militarily? Well, it was a state that managed, primarily through its naval and British Empire in this case, the naval power, policing power, to manage a global system of connected markets. Connected in the sense of commodity trade. There were very little barriers to trade. Tariffs were near zero. Connected in the sense of very little barriers to movements of people. It was expensive, but only transport costs, only the movement costs, not expensive in terms of visa and barriers, legal barriers. And millions of people went from India primarily, and also China, to work in the tropical colonies of Britain. It was also connected a global system in the sense of cross-border capital movements. A lot of that capital went into railway building in Asia and Africa. So it was a very connected market, very robust globalization, managed by a relatively weak state. Legislation doesn't cost money. You can pass laws. And the British Empire was passing laws all the time in property, in contract, in banking, in all sorts of ways, which contributed to running this global system of markets. But state capacity was limited, which led to low investments. There are two further questions that I want to talk about. One of them is whether what I've so far talked about is largely applicable to the British Empire, but did being a British colonial system or a French or a Dutch really matter to outcomes? And a fourth set of questions about how the colonies contributed to imperial power. As I said, there was a very strong military presence everywhere. Indian army was several 100,000 strong, was really the empire of the British, really the army of the British Empire. So what does that mean? Now, that leads us to understanding impact in a slightly different way, impact in individual regions. Now take India, for example. Here you have a system which is very robust in terms of market transactions. Market-based economic growth always creates inequalities because people who have things to sell will get better off than those who don't. Somebody engaged in commercial agriculture will be better off than a subsistence farmer. somebody with access to railways will get better off than somebody who doesn't. But at the same time, a state which doesn't really have much capacity to do the kind of things that we expect states to do in redressing inequality, like redistribution. So of course, that leads to a different kind of agenda for individual colonies, one that is very closely focused on inequality. For a long time, historians like these two individuals who have shaped our field in a very significant way have shown how significant India is for any argument about economic history or imperial history. But at the same time, how constrained this field is, because the state collected data on what it really wanted data on, mainly revenue system. Almost everything else, like inequality, as I said, the state didn't collect enough data on. So you have to be innovative in doing research in this area. Varieties of inequality, I mean, again, going back to India and British Empire, if you think of cities like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, they collectively became a home of the fourth largest cotton textile mill industry in the world, which emerged largely in competition with Manchester under fairly zero tariffs, near zero tariffs. That's extraordinary. But step into the countryside, just 100 miles from any of these cities, and you will reach a very poor countryside which really had seen no positive change for hundreds of years. So that's one example of the inequality. But think of now the factories as employers, about 500,000, close to 1 million people who went to these cities to work in factories. They were significantly better off than agricultural workers. And they were better off, their income was more secure than that of the peasant farmer, whose incomes were subject to climatic changes. Once again, you have an inequality opening up. And similarly, inequality between irrigated agriculture, dry agriculture, and men and women. Now think of the factory example again. Almost, there's 1 million people who went to the factories to work. They came from the countryside, but almost 80% of them were men. This is a South Asian thing. Migration is extremely male biased in South Asia for a very long time, even today. It doesn't exist as much in East Asia, Southeast Asia. It exists in South Asia. And when you look at the reasons why that was the case, you see a very simple explanation. Most women married young. At 1900, the average age at marriage of girls was 13, as low as that. When you have that kind of a society, most girls, the average girl will by the time they attain adulthood, they already have a family to mind. They cannot join this long distance migration flows. That syndrome is still not completely, hasn't disappeared from South Asian migration flows today. So of course that creates an inequality. And finally, what I'll end with is another dimension of inequality on regions. Think of, look at these 3 maps. One of them shows the political borders between princely states and British India around 1900. That's the map at your left. Then there is a map in the middle which shows the climatic zones, and the climatic zones vary radically between semi-arid, very arid areas in western India, southern India, and very wet, very monsoon-fed areas in eastern India. And then you have geology. The third map shows geological patterns. And you have uplands, you have the Himalayan mountains, which have rivers coming down fed by snowmelt. They're huge river systems. And you have much drier areas in southern India, western India, much less rains, but also geological formations such that it's very hard to acquire water either from the rivers or from underground. But the point of this is that the political borders don't coincide with climatic and geographical borders. Now we know that environment matters. If it matters, And if we get all our data on economic changes from the political units, districts, states, princely states, provinces, then there is a problem of understanding inequality, because inequality we know should have a geographical environmental dimensions, but we have no, once again, we have to be innovative in capturing the dimension. So you need different methods. And partly that search for new methods to address these new questions have led to the return to the Asian and African archives in a very big way, in which economic historians have led and which Mohamed talked about. Thank you.